25 years ago, federal agents raided a storage unit in Lansing, Illinois, and discovered something that would change 2 generations forever. $1 million in cash and 10 kilos of... The man behind this empire? Dante Banks, better known as Big Durk, a name that would echo through Chicago's streets and eventually birth one of hip-hop's biggest stars. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. While Big Durk served a life sentence for refusing to snitch, his infant son would grow up to become Lil Durk, only to potentially face the same federal charges that destroyed his father's life. This is the story of how $8 million, 6 bricks, and one man's loyalty to the street code created a legacy that spans from the epidemic to the Billboard charts, and how karma might be coming full circle. To understand this story, you gotta understand Inglewood in the 1980s and 90s. This wasn't just any Chicago neighborhood. This was ground zero for where the gangster disciples and black disciples turned street corners into battlefields, and where young men like Dante Banks learned that survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant taking control. Born into a family of 10 children with a mother struggling with addiction, Dante Banks became the man of the house at just 12 years old. But unlike most kids forced to grow up fast, Big Durk, as he'd soon be known, had a natural gift for leadership and an eye for opportunity that would make him millions before his 25th birthday. The epidemic of the 1980s and 90s devastated black communities across America, but it also created unprecedented opportunities for young men willing to risk everything. In Chicago, the combination of economic desperation, gang infrastructure, and an endless supply of South America created the perfect storm for the rise of kingpins like Big Durk. Inglewood wasn't always the war zone it became. In the 1960s and 70s, it was a working-class neighborhood with stable families and legitimate businesses. But as manufacturing jobs disappeared and flooded the streets, the neighborhood transformed into something resembling a combat zone. By the time Big Durk was coming of age, Inglewood had one of the highest murder rates in Chicago, with young men more likely to end up dead or in prison than to graduate high school. The gangster disciples and black disciples weren't just gangs. They were parallel governments that controlled territory, collected taxes through and maintained order through violence. For a young man like Dante Banks, joining one of these organizations wasn't just about making money. It was about survival and respect in a world where both were in short supply. The transformation from regular kid to street legend doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process of small compromises, increasing stakes, and the intoxicating rush of power and money. For Big Durk, that transformation began with watching the hustlers, gamblers, and players who controlled his neighborhood's economy. Every kingpin has an origin story, and Big Durk's began with an 8-ball of a cousin willing to put him on. At just 13 years old, Dante Banks stood on a freezing Chicago corner trying to flip his first pack. That moment, he says, transformed him from Dante Banks into Big Durk. But Big Durk wasn't content being just another corner boy. Even in high school at Paul Robeson on 69th and Normal, his reputation for moving serious weight caught the attention of the most powerful gang in Chicago, the Gangster Disciples. The Gangster Disciples weren't just a street gang. They were a sophisticated criminal organization founded by Larry Hoover and David Barksdale in 1969. By the 1990s, they operated across 110 cities in 31 states, with a hierarchy more complex than most corporations. The organization had its own constitution, ranking system, and business model that generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually. What made the GDs different from other gangs was their emphasis on organization and discipline. Larry Hoover, even from prison, maintained strict control over the organization's operations. Members were expected to follow a code of conduct, contribute to the organization's growth, and maintain loyalty above all else. For a young hustler like Big Durk, joining the GDs meant access to protection, territory, and most importantly, a reliable supply chain. The recruitment process for the GDs was methodical. They would identify young men in high schools who showed leadership potential and were already involved in street activities. These recruits would be tested, trained, and gradually integrated into the organization's structure. The fact that Big Durk was chosen as a shot caller for his neighborhood at such a young age spoke to his natural leadership abilities and street credibility. Being a shot caller meant more than just selling. It meant managing territory, resolving disputes, collecting debts, and maintaining the organization's reputation through violence when necessary. It was a position that required intelligence, ruthlessness, and the ability to command respect from both subordinates and rivals. The money that came with this position was unlike anything most young men from Inglewood had ever seen. We're talking about thousands of dollars per week in an era when minimum wage was less than $5 per hour. For someone who had grown up in poverty, watching his mother struggle with addiction and homelessness, this kind of money represented not just wealth, but power and security. But with great power came great risk. The higher Big Durk rose in the GD hierarchy, the more attention he attracted from law enforcement. Federal agents were already building cases against high-ranking GD members using wiretaps, surveillance, and informants to map the organization's structure and operations. Being chosen as a shot caller for his neighborhood wasn't just an honor. It was a direct pipeline to the top of Chicago's. And at the very top sat Larry Hoover himself, serving multiple life sentences but still running the GD empire from behind federal prison walls. What happened next would change Big Durk's life forever. The senior GDs approved his request to meet Larry Hoover face-to-face in prison. Picture this, a young street hustler from Inglewood sitting across from one of America's most notorious gang leaders, fuel millions. Larry Hoover was already a legend by the time Big Durk met him. Born in Mississippi and raised in Chicago, Hoover had co-founded the Gangster Disciples in 1969 and built them into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in American history. Even after being sentenced to 150 to 200 years in prison for murder in 1973, Hoover continued to run the GDs through a network of loyal lieutenants and sophisticated communication systems. The meeting between Big Durk and Larry Hoover wasn't just a casual conversation. It was a business meeting between a CEO and a regional manager. Hoover was known for his intelligence, charisma, and ability to inspire loyalty even from behind bars. He had transformed the GDs from a street gang into what prosecutors called a criminal enterprise with its own hierarchy, rules, and business model. For Big Durk, meeting Larry Hoover was like a young entrepreneur getting FaceTime with Warren Buffett. Hoover's reputation for strategic thinking and organizational skills was legendary, and his blessing could make or break a young hustler's career. The fact that they clicked and developed a beautiful relationship meant that Big Durk now had the backing of the most powerful criminal organization in Chicago. This relationship gave Big Durk access to resources that most street-level dealers could only dream of. The GDs had established supply chains that brought directly from South American cartels to Chicago's streets. They had money laundering operations, legitimate businesses that served as fronts, and a network of corrupt officials who provided protection and information. But perhaps most importantly, Larry Hoover's endorsement gave Big Durk credibility and respect throughout Chicago's criminal underworld. When word spread that he had Larry Hoover's blessing, other dealers, suppliers, and even rival gang members knew they were dealing with someone who had serious backing. The influence of Larry Hoover on Big Durk's operation cannot be overstated. Hoover's organizational principles, discipline, loyalty, and strategic thinking became the foundation of Big Durk's. The sophisticated structure that Big Durk would eventually build, with its clear hierarchy, specialized roles, and systematic approach to distribution, bore all the hallmarks of Larry Hoover's influence. The empire, structure and scale, 12 o'clock to 5:30 p.m. With Larry Hoover's blessing and the GD infrastructure behind him, Big Durk's operation exploded. We're talking about a 24/7 empire that operated like a Fortune 500 company, complete with shifts, territories, enforcers, and people whose only job was counting money. According to federal court documents, Big Durk's operation wasn't some small-time corner hustle. This was a sophisticated organization that moved an estimated 85 kilos between 1991 and 1993. That's nearly 200 pounds of pure product transformed into millions of. At the top of the pyramid sat Big Durk himself, described by prosecutors as the primary organizer of a. But here's what made his operation different. Big Durk handled every aspect personally. He sourced the it into crack in his own kitchen and broke it down into individual dime bags. To put this in perspective, during the height of the With 85 kilos moving through his operation, we're looking at potential street value exceeding $8 million, exactly the number Lil Durk mentioned when he told DJ Vlad about his father's arrest. Big Durk's organizational structure read like a corporate hierarchy. His top lieutenant was Robert Shipp, with enforcers Mario Dunlop and Alton Mills handling security and collections. The operation ran in shifts, employed people just to count money, and maintained multiple stash houses across Chicago. The sophistication of Big Durk's operation was remarkable for its time. This wasn't just a bunch of guys selling drugs on corners. This was a vertically integrated business that controlled every aspect of the drug trade, from supply to street sales. Big Durk had established relationships with suppliers who could provide large quantities of pure cocaine at wholesale prices. He had developed a system for cooking cocaine into crack that maximized profit margins while maintaining consistent quality. The distribution network was equally impressive. Big Durk had divided his territory into zones, each managed by a trusted lieutenant who oversaw multiple street-level dealers. These dealers worked in shifts to ensure 24-hour coverage, maximizing sales while minimizing the risk of any individual getting caught with large quantities of drugs. The money-counting operation alone employed several people full-time. When you're moving millions of dollars in small bills, the logistics of handling cash become a major challenge. Big Durk's organization had developed systems for counting, bundling, and storing cash that would have impressed legitimate businesses. Security was another crucial aspect of the operation. Mario Dunlop and Alton Mills weren't just muscle. They were strategic enforcers who handled everything from debt collection to territorial disputes. They maintained the organization's reputation through calculated violence, ensuring that competitors, customers, and even law enforcement understood the consequences of interfering with Big Durk's business. The Stash House network was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the operation. Rather than keeping large quantities of drugs or money in one location, Big Durk had established multiple safe houses throughout Chicago and the surrounding suburbs. This distributed approach minimized losses if any single location was compromised and made it much harder for law enforcement to shut down the entire operation. This confidence wasn't just bravado. It was based on a sophisticated understanding of law enforcement patterns and territorial control. Big Durk had essentially created a drug distribution network that operated around the clock while police worked traditional shifts. The lifestyle that came with running a multi-million-dollar drug operation was intoxicating. Big Durk wasn't just making money, he was accumulating the kind of wealth that transformed him from a kid from Inglewood into a neighborhood legend. The cars, jewelry, clothes, and cash that came with his success weren't just material possessions. They were symbols of power and respect in a community where both were rare commodities. But the money was just one aspect of Big Durk's transformation. The respect he commanded throughout Chicago's criminal underworld was equally important. When Big Durk walked into a room, conversations stopped. When he spoke, people listened. This wasn't just fear. It was genuine respect for someone who had built something significant in a world where most people struggled just to survive. The psychological impact of this kind of success cannot be understated. For someone who had grown up watching his mother struggle with addiction and homelessness, the ability to provide for his family and command respect in his community was intoxicating. Big Durk wasn't just selling drugs. He was building an empire that would provide security and opportunity for generations. The social dynamics of Big Durk's success were complex. In the legitimate world, his activities were clearly criminal and harmful to his community. But in the street economy of the 1990s, Chicago, Big Durk was a successful entrepreneur who had created jobs, provided opportunities, and brought money into a neighborhood that had been abandoned by legitimate businesses and government services. This contradiction between the harm caused by crack cocaine and the economic opportunities created by the drug trade was at the heart of Big Durk's story. He was simultaneously destroying his community through drug sales and empowering it through economic activity. This duality would later influence his transformation in prison and his work as a community advocate after his release. The influence that Big Durk wielded extended far beyond his immediate organization. Other young men in Inglewood looked up to him as a role model and success story. His lifestyle, the cars, clothes, and cash became the standard that others aspired to achieve. This influence would prove to be both a blessing and a curse, as it inspired others to follow his path while also attracting the attention of law enforcement. The relationship between Big Durk and his community was complicated. While his drug sales contributed to addiction and violence, his success also brought money and opportunities to a neighborhood that had few legitimate options. He employed dozens of people, supported local businesses, and provided a model of black entrepreneurship in a community that had been largely abandoned by mainstream economic opportunities. The beginning of the end, federal attention. But every empire has its weaknesses, and Big Durk's would come from the most unexpected source: family. The beginning of the end came in 1993, and it started with a high-speed chase that would unravel everything Big Durk had built. By the early 1990s, federal law enforcement had declared war on crack cocaine and the organizations that distributed it. The Drug Enforcement Administration, FBI, and local police departments were working together to build cases against major drug trafficking organizations. The GDS, as one of the largest and most sophisticated criminal organizations in the country, were a primary target. The federal approach to prosecuting drug cases had evolved significantly by the 1990s. Rather than focusing on individual dealers or small-time operations, federal agents were using wiretaps, surveillance, and financial investigations to build conspiracy cases against entire organizations. These cases could result in life sentences for leaders and lengthy prison terms for even low-level participants. Big Durk's operation had grown large enough to attract federal attention, but sophisticated enough to avoid easy detection. The 24/7 nature of his business, combined with the distributed network of stash houses and the careful compartmentalization of information, made it difficult for law enforcement to build a comprehensive case. However, federal agents had been watching Big Durk's organization for months, using a combination of surveillance, wiretaps, and informants to map its structure and operations. They knew about his relationship with Larry Hoover, his role in the GD hierarchy, and the scope of his drug trafficking activities. The challenge for federal prosecutors was gathering enough evidence to prove conspiracy charges that would result in significant prison sentences. Drug conspiracy cases require proof that defendants knowingly participated in an ongoing criminal enterprise, and that evidence often comes from wiretapped conversations, financial records, and testimony from cooperating witnesses. Alton Mills, one of his top enforcers, was being tailed by federal agents when they attempted to pull him over. What happened next was straight out of a movie. Mills hit the gas, leading police on a chase through Chicago streets before allegedly throwing half a kilo of cocaine out his car window. The feds never recovered that package, but they didn't need to, because the very next day, they intercepted a phone call that would seal Big Durk's fate. The high-speed chase involving Alton Mills was the kind of dramatic event that federal prosecutors love to include in their cases. It demonstrated the lengths to which Big Durk's organization would go to avoid arrest, and it provided concrete evidence of drug trafficking activity. Even though the cocaine was never recovered, the fact that Mills threw it out the window during a police chase was powerful evidence of guilt. But the real breakthrough came with the intercepted phone conversation the following day. Federal wiretaps had been monitoring Big Durk's phone calls for weeks, and the conversation about candy provided exactly the kind of evidence prosecutors needed to prove conspiracy charges. The feds didn't need Sherlock Holmes to figure out what candy meant, and just 4 days after this intercepted call, they hit Big Durk's storage unit in Lansing, Illinois, discovering exactly what they expected: 10 kilos of cocaine and $1 million in cash. The intercepted phone conversation was a prosecutor's dream. In clear, unambiguous language, Big Durk and his associates discussed the location of drugs, the arrest of a key member of their organization, and their plans to recover the candy that had been thrown out during the police chase. This conversation provided direct evidence of Big Durk's leadership role in the organization and his knowledge of its drug trafficking activities. Federal wiretaps are incredibly powerful tools in drug conspiracy cases because they capture defendants in their own words discussing criminal activities, unlike testimony from cooperating witnesses, which can be challenged as unreliable or motivated by self-interest. Wiretapped conversations provide unfiltered evidence of criminal intent and activity. The timing of the phone call, just one day after Alton Mills's arrest and the high-speed chase, made it even more damaging. It showed that Big Durk was actively managing his organization's response to law enforcement pressure and was personally involved in efforts to recover drugs that had been lost during the chase. The language used in the conversation, while coded, was clear enough for prosecutors to argue that candy referred to cocaine, and that Big Durk was the leader of the organization trying to recover it. The fact that multiple participants in the conversation deferred to Big Durk's authority provided additional evidence of his leadership role. The decision to raid the storage unit in Lansing was based directly on information gathered from this wiretapped conversation. Federal agents had been building their case for months, but the phone call provided the probable cause they needed to obtain search warrants for Big Durk's stash locations. The discovery of 10 kilos of cocaine and $1 million in cash was the final piece of evidence prosecutors needed to build their conspiracy case. This wasn't just a small amount of drugs that could be explained away. This was clear evidence of a major drug trafficking operation with the kind of money and product that could only come from wholesale distribution. But the real betrayal came from within his own family. Tasha Woods, Big Durk's own cousin and the girlfriend of his enforcer Mario Dunlop, had been cooperating with federal agents. She agreed to testify against the entire organization in exchange for a reduced sentence. The use of family members as cooperating witnesses is one of the most devastating tactics in federal drug prosecutions. When someone close to the defendant agrees to testify, they often have access to information that would be impossible for law enforcement to obtain through surveillance or wiretaps alone. Tasha Wood's decision to cooperate was particularly damaging because of her multiple relationships within Big Durk's organization. As his cousin, she had access to family information and personal details about his life and activities. As Mario Dunlop's girlfriend, she had insight into the enforcement and security aspects of the operation. This dual perspective made her an incredibly valuable witness for federal prosecutors. The decision to cooperate with federal authorities is never taken lightly, especially in communities where snitching is considered one of the worst possible betrayals. Tasha Woods would have faced intense pressure from both law enforcement and the criminal organization to make a choice that would define the rest of her life. Federal prosecutors are skilled at creating situations where cooperation seems like the only rational choice. They use a combination of evidence, potential sentences, and promises of protection to convince witnesses to testify against their former associates. In Tasha Woods' case, the alternative to cooperation would have been facing serious federal charges herself. The impact of Tasha Woods' cooperation extended far beyond just providing testimony. Her decision to work with federal authorities likely provided prosecutors with detailed information about the organization's structure, operations, and key players. This information would have been used to guide the investigation and build cases against other members of the organization. The betrayal by a family member was particularly painful for Big Durk because it violated one of the most fundamental principles of street culture: loyalty to family. In a world where trust was rare and betrayal could be fatal, the decision by his own cousin to cooperate with federal authorities was seen as the ultimate violation. The psychological impact of this betrayal cannot be understated. For someone who had built his entire identity around loyalty and respect, being betrayed by a family member was devastating. It called into question everything Big Durk believed about loyalty, family, and the code of the streets. The federal case against Big Durk revealed the true scope of his operation. Court testimony showed that his suppliers had delivered more than 85 kilos of cocaine to his organization over 2 years. But here's where the story gets even more twisted. Those same suppliers who sold him the drugs turned state's evidence against him. The suppliers, who admitted to selling Big Durk 85 kilos of cocaine, received sentences of just 11.5 years and 9 years respectively. Meanwhile, Big Durk and his crew faced life sentences under federal crack cocaine guidelines that were notoriously harsh. Federal drug conspiracy cases are built on the principle that all members of a criminal organization are equally responsible for the total amount of drugs involved in the conspiracy. This means that even if Big Durk personally handled only a fraction of the 85 kilos, he could be held responsible for the entire amount because of his leadership role in the organization. The decision by Big Durk's suppliers to cooperate with federal authorities was a strategic move that allowed them to receive significantly reduced sentences in exchange for their testimony. This cooperation was crucial for prosecutors because it provided direct evidence of the scope and scale of Big Durk's operation. The testimony from cooperating suppliers painted a picture of a sophisticated drug trafficking organization that operated at a wholesale level. These weren't street-level dealers selling small quantities. These were major suppliers who were moving kilos of cocaine at a time. Their testimony established that Big Durk was operating at the highest levels of the drug trade. The 85 kilos of cocaine that moved through Big Durk's organization represented millions of dollars in street value. When transformed into crack cocaine, this amount of product could generate between $6 to $8 million in revenue, exactly the amount that Lil Durk mentioned in his interview with DJ Vlad. The federal charges against Big Durk and his organization were comprehensive and devastating. The conspiracy charges meant that each defendant could be held responsible for the entire scope of the organization's activities, regardless of their individual role. This approach allowed prosecutors to seek maximum sentences for all participants. The evidence presented in the case included wiretapped phone conversations, financial records, testimony from cooperating witnesses, and physical evidence seized during raids. This combination of evidence types made it virtually impossible for defendants to challenge the government's case. The use of the federal court system rather than state courts was significant because federal sentences are typically much harsher than state sentences for similar crimes. Federal judges have less discretion in sentencing, and federal prisoners must serve at least 85% of their sentences with no possibility of parole. To understand why Big Durk received such a harsh sentence, you need to understand one of the most controversial aspects of 1990s drug law: the crack versus powder cocaine sentencing disparity. Under federal guidelines at the time, 1 gram of crack cocaine carried the same sentence as 100 grams of powder cocaine. This 100-to-1 ratio meant that crack dealers, predominantly black men from inner cities, received sentences 100 times harsher than powder cocaine dealers, who were more likely to be white and suburban. Even the judge who sentenced Big Durk expressed reluctance about the mandatory guidelines. According to news reports, the judge stated he didn't want to hand down such a harsh sentence, but federal crack cocaine laws tied his hands. The crack versus powder cocaine sentencing disparity was one of the most controversial aspects of federal drug policy in the 1990s. Critics argued that the disparity was inherently racist because crack cocaine was predominantly used and sold in black communities, while powder cocaine was more common in white, suburban communities. The scientific basis for the sentencing disparity was questionable at best. While crack cocaine is more potent than powder cocaine, both drugs are chemically similar and have similar effects on users. The argument that crack was 100 times more dangerous than powder cocaine was not supported by medical or scientific evidence. The impact of this sentencing disparity on black communities was devastating. Thousands of black men received life sentences or decades in prison for crack cocaine offenses that would have resulted in much shorter sentences if they had involved powder cocaine. This disparity contributed to the mass incarceration of black men and the destruction of black families and communities. The mandatory minimum sentences for crack cocaine offenses meant that judges had no discretion in sentencing, even in cases where they believed the sentences were excessive. This removed the human element from sentencing and resulted in harsh punishments that often seemed disproportionate to the crimes committed. The political context of the crack cocaine epidemic also influenced sentencing policies. The crack epidemic coincided with the tough-on-crime movement of the 1980s and 1990s, which emphasized harsh punishments as a deterrent to drug use and trafficking. Politicians competed to appear tough on crime, leading to increasingly harsh sentencing laws. The racial implications of the sentencing disparity were clear to anyone who looked at the demographics of federal drug prisoners. The vast majority of people serving life sentences for crack cocaine offenses were black men from inner cities, while white defendants charged with powder cocaine offenses received much shorter sentences. At 25 years old, Big Durk was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His girlfriend received 10 years. His top lieutenants, Robert Shipp, Mario Dunlop, and Alton Mills, all received life sentences. Meanwhile, the suppliers who provided the drugs that fueled the entire operation walked away with less than 12 years each. But there was one more twist to this story that would define Big Durk's legacy. The feds wanted him to flip on Larry Hoover. According to Lil Durk, federal agents offered his father a deal: provide information about Larry Hoover and the Gangster Disciples operations, and receive a reduced sentence. Big Durk's response would cement his reputation in Chicago streets forever. Big Durk refused to cooperate. He chose to serve a life sentence rather than provide information about Larry Hoover or anyone else in the Gangster Disciples organization. In the streets, this decision made him a legend. In federal prison, it meant he would likely die behind bars. The decision to refuse cooperation with federal authorities was consistent with Big Durk's character and the code of the streets that had shaped his life. In the criminal underworld, cooperation with law enforcement is considered the ultimate betrayal, and those who snitch are marked for violence and social ostracism. The pressure that federal prosecutors can bring to bear on defendants to secure cooperation is enormous. They have the power to recommend reduced sentences, placement in witness protection programs, and other benefits for those who agree to testify. The alternative, life in prison, is designed to make cooperation seem like the only rational choice. Big Durk's refusal to cooperate was particularly significant because of his relationship with Larry Hoover and his high-ranking position in the Gangster Disciples. His testimony could have provided federal prosecutors with valuable information about the organization's structure, operations, and leadership that would have been difficult to obtain elsewhere. The decision to remain loyal to Larry Hoover and the Gangster Disciples, even at the cost of his own freedom, demonstrated the depth of Big Durk's commitment to the organization and its principles. This loyalty was not just personal. It was ideological, based on a belief system that valued loyalty and respect above personal safety or freedom. The impact of Big Durk's decision extended far beyond his own case. His refusal to cooperate sent a message throughout Chicago's criminal underworld that he was someone who could be trusted, even under the most extreme pressure. This reputation would serve him well during his time in prison and after his eventual release. The psychological toll of choosing life in prison over cooperation cannot be understated. Big Durk was 25 years old, with a young family when he made this decision. He was choosing to give up his freedom, his relationship with his children, and potentially the rest of his life to maintain his loyalty to an organization and its leader. 25 years. That's how long Big Durk spent in federal prison, watching his infant son grow up through phone calls, letters, and prison visits. But his time behind bars wasn't wasted. It was a period of profound transformation. While incarcerated, Big Durk converted to Islam and became a leader in the prison's Muslim community. According to fellow inmates, he was known for pressing other prisoners to practice their faith correctly and carry themselves with dignity. The transformation that Big Durk underwent in prison was remarkable and genuine. The man who entered federal prison as a drug kingpin and gang leader emerged 25 years later as a community advocate and religious leader. This transformation was not just superficial. It represented a fundamental change in his worldview and priorities. The decision to convert to Islam was significant for several reasons. Islam provided Big Durk with a moral framework that was different from the street code that had governed his life. The emphasis on discipline, community service, and personal responsibility offered an alternative to the violence and materialism that had defined his previous existence. The leadership role that Big Durk assumed in the prison's Muslim community demonstrated his continued ability to inspire and guide others, but now in a positive direction. Rather than leading a criminal organization, he was helping other prisoners find meaning and purpose through religious practice and personal development. The respect that Big Durk commanded in prison was based not on fear or violence, but on his genuine commitment to helping others improve their lives. Fellow inmates looked up to him as someone who had successfully transformed himself and could help them do the same. Throughout his incarceration, Big Durk maintained a close relationship with his children, especially Lil Durk, who was born just 7 months before his father's arrest. The young Durk Banks would visit his father regularly, put money on his books, and seek advice about navigating life in Chicago. But perhaps most importantly, Big Durk used his time in prison to counsel his son against following the same path that had cost him his freedom. The irony of a man serving life for drug trafficking trying to steer his son away from the streets was not lost on either father or son. The relationship between Big Durk and Lil Durk during the prison years was complex and profound. Here was a father trying to guide his son from behind bars, using his own mistakes as cautionary tales while watching his son navigate the same dangerous streets that had led to his own downfall. From behind prison walls, Big Durk watched his son transform from a young man fascinated by his father's street legend into one of Chicago's most promising rap artists. And in 2017, something happened that nobody expected. Big Durk won his appeal. After serving nearly 25 years of a life sentence, Big Durk's legal team successfully argued his case on appeal. Changes in federal sentencing guidelines, combined with procedural issues in his original trial, created an opportunity for his sentence to be commuted. On February 12, 2019, Lil Durk sent a tweet that shocked the hip-hop world: "Big Durk home." After 25 years in federal prison, Dante Banks was finally free. The legal basis for Big Durk's successful appeal was complex and involved multiple factors. Changes in federal sentencing guidelines, particularly regarding crack cocaine offenses, had created opportunities for prisoners serving life sentences to have their cases reviewed. The Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 had reduced the crack versus powder cocaine sentencing disparity from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1, and some provisions of the law were applied retroactively. Additionally, Big Durk's legal team was able to identify procedural issues in his original trial that provided grounds for appeal. These issues, combined with the changes in sentencing law, created a legal pathway for his sentence to be reduced from life to a term that he had already served. The reunion between father and son was emotional and profound. Here was a man who had entered prison when his son was an infant, now meeting that son as a successful recording artist with millions of fans worldwide. The 25 years that had passed represented an entire generation of separation and missed opportunities. The impact of Big Durk's release extended far beyond his immediate family. In Chicago's hip-hop community, his return was seen as a victory against a system that had destroyed countless black families through harsh drug sentences. His story became a symbol of redemption and the possibility of second chances. But Big Durk's freedom came with a mission. Rather than returning to the streets that had made him millions and cost him decades, he chose a different path. Working with Chicago Cred, a nonprofit organization dedicated to reducing gun violence through mentorship and community outreach. This transformation from drug kingpin to community advocate represented a complete reversal of everything Big Durk had once stood for. The man who had once contributed to his community's destruction was now working to repair the damage he had caused. While Big Durk was transforming himself in prison, his son Durk Banks was building his own empire. Not with drugs, but with music. Starting with mixtapes in the early 2000s, Lil Durk gradually built a following that would eventually make him one of hip-hop's biggest stars. But success in hip-hop, especially drill music from Chicago, comes with its own dangers. Lil Durk's lyrics often referenced street life, his father's legacy, and ongoing conflicts with rival gangs and artists. What many fans saw as authentic storytelling, federal investigators began viewing as potential evidence. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the family's history. Here was Big Durk, finally free and working to steer young people away from the streets, while his son's music career was built partly on celebrating the same lifestyle that had cost his father 25 years of freedom. Lil Durk's rise in the music industry was meteoric and well-deserved. His ability to translate the pain and struggle of Chicago's streets into compelling music resonated with millions of fans worldwide. Songs like "This Ain't What You Want" and "This Ain't What You Want" showcased his storytelling ability and authentic connection to the streets. The influence of his father's story on Lil Durk's music was undeniable. References to Big Durk's imprisonment, his refusal to cooperate with authorities, and the impact of his absence on the family appeared throughout Lil Durk's discography. These references served both as tribute to his father and as authentic details that gave his music credibility. The success that Lil Durk achieved was exactly what his father had hoped for, a legitimate path to wealth and respect that didn't involve the risks and consequences of street life. By 2021, Lil Durk had achieved everything his father had dreamed of: legitimate millions, mainstream success, and respect across the hip-hop industry. He had signed with major labels, collaborated with superstars like Drake and Kanye West, and built a brand worth tens of millions of dollars. His record label, Only the Family, OTF, had become a platform for other Chicago artists to achieve success and escape the streets. But success in the music industry didn't insulate Lil Durk from the streets that had shaped his father's life. Ongoing feuds, particularly with Chicago rapper King Von's death in 2020, kept pulling him back into conflicts that would eventually attract federal attention. The death of King Von was a turning point in Lil Durk's story. Von, who was signed to OTF and considered like a brother to Durk, was killed in Atlanta in November 2020 during a confrontation with rival rappers. The loss devastated Lil Durk and set in motion a series of events that would lead to his own federal charges. In October 2024, the cycle that had begun with Big Durk's arrest 30 years earlier came full circle. Federal agents arrested Lil Durk in Florida, charging him with conspiracy to commit murder for hire in connection with the 2022 shooting in Los Angeles. The charges alleged that Lil Durk had used his OTF record label to fund and coordinate violent retaliation against rivals. If convicted, he could face life in prison, the same sentence his father had received for drug trafficking 3 decades earlier. The parallels between father and son are impossible to ignore. Both built empires in their respective fields. Both achieved wealth and respect in their communities. Both faced federal charges that could result in life sentences, and both were offered opportunities to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for reduced sentences. The federal case against Lil Durk represents a new evolution in how law enforcement targets hip-hop artists. Rather than focusing solely on drug trafficking, prosecutors are now building cases around allegations of violence and conspiracy that use rap lyrics, social media posts, and music videos as evidence. The charges against Lil Durk paint a picture remarkably similar to his father's case, a sophisticated criminal organization using legitimate businesses as fronts, coordinating illegal activities across state lines and generating millions of dollars in the process. The main difference is that where Big Durk's empire was built on crack cocaine, Lil Durk's alleged crimes stem from rap feuds and street conflicts. The use of the murder-for-hire statute in Lil Durk's case is significant because it carries the same potential life sentence that his father received for drug trafficking. This demonstrates how federal prosecutors have adapted their tactics to target different types of criminal activity while maintaining the same harsh sentencing outcomes. The timing of Lil Durk's arrest, coming just 5 years after his father's release from prison, adds another layer of tragedy to the story. Here was a family that had seemingly broken the cycle of incarceration, only to see the next generation potentially face the same fate. The impact of Lil Durk's arrest on his family, particularly his father, cannot be understated. Big Durk had spent 25 years in prison and dedicated his freedom to steering young people away from the streets, only to watch his own son potentially face the same consequences that had defined his own life. The story of Big Durk and Lil Durk isn't just about one family's struggle with the criminal justice system. It's a window into larger questions about race, class, and justice in America. Consider the disparities. Big Durk's drug suppliers, who provided the cocaine that fueled his entire operation, received sentences of less than 12 years. Meanwhile, Big Durk and his street-level dealers received life sentences. The suppliers were likely white and middle class. Big Durk and his crew were black men from the inner city. This pattern repeats throughout the federal justice system. According to the U.S. Sentencing Commission, black men receive sentences roughly 20% longer than white men for the same crimes. For drug offenses, the disparity is even greater. The crack versus powder cocaine sentencing disparity that destroyed Big Durk's life was eventually reduced from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1 in 2010, but thousands of men like Big Durk had already lost decades of their lives to these discriminatory policies. Now, with Lil Durk facing federal charges, we're seeing a new form of the same pattern. Hip-hop artists, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds, face intense federal scrutiny for lyrics and associations that would be ignored if they came from other genres or communities. The use of rap lyrics as evidence in criminal cases has increased dramatically over the past decade. Prosecutors argue that these lyrics represent confessions or evidence of criminal intent. Defense attorneys counter that they're artistic expression protected by the First Amendment. The federal government's approach to prosecuting hip-hop artists mirrors its historical approach to prosecuting drug dealers, targeting high-profile figures with maximum sentences while often ignoring the systemic issues that create these problems in the first place. The economic factors that drive both drug trafficking and the conflicts that lead to violence in hip-hop are rooted in the same systemic inequalities that have plagued Black communities for generations. Lack of economic opportunity, failing schools, and the absence of legitimate pathways to success create environments where both drug dealing and street conflicts flourish. The role of social media and streaming platforms in amplifying conflicts between artists has created new challenges for law enforcement and the justice system. What might have once been local disputes are now broadcast to millions of followers, creating pressure for public retaliation and escalation. The intersection of legitimate business success and street credibility in hip-hop creates unique challenges for artists who achieve mainstream success while maintaining connections to their communities. The pressure to remain authentic can lead to continued involvement in conflicts that threaten their freedom and safety. Some observers have called it karma. The idea that Big Durk's refusal to leave the streets behind, even after his release, somehow cursed his son to repeat the same cycle. Others see it as the inevitable result of a system that criminalizes Black success, whether in the drug trade or the music industry. The concept of karma in this context is complex and controversial. On one hand, there's the argument that Big Durk's involvement in drug trafficking and the violence that accompanied it created negative energy that has continued to affect his family. On the other hand, there's the argument that systemic racism and inequality create cycles of incarceration that trap families regardless of individual choices. The question of whether Big Durk could have done more to prevent his son from facing similar charges is complicated by the realities of growing up in Chicago's most dangerous neighborhoods. Even with his father's guidance and warnings, Lil Durk was still exposed to the same environmental factors that had shaped his father's choices. The influence of Big Durk's legend on his son's identity and career choices cannot be ignored. Lil Durk has spoken openly about wanting to be just like his father, admiring the wealth and respect that came with his father's street success. This admiration, while understandable, may have contributed to choices that led to his current legal troubles. The role of trauma in perpetuating cycles of violence and incarceration is well documented in psychological research. Growing up with a father in prison, witnessing violence in his community, and experiencing the loss of friends and family members to street violence all contribute to trauma that can influence decision-making and behavior. The pressure that comes with success in hip-hop, particularly for artists from violent communities, creates unique challenges. The expectation to remain connected to the streets while achieving mainstream success can lead to conflicts between business interests and street loyalty. The impact of social media on these dynamics cannot be understated. Conflicts that might have once been resolved privately are now played out in front of millions of followers, creating pressure for public responses and escalation that can lead to violence and legal consequences. The question that haunts this story is whether Lil Durk will make the same choice his father made, refusing to cooperate with federal investigators even if it means spending the rest of his life in prison, or will he break the cycle that has defined his family for generations? As of this recording, Lil Durk remains in federal custody, facing charges that could result in a life sentence. His father, now in his 50s and working as a community advocate, faces the possibility of watching his son disappear into the same federal prison system that consumed 25 years of his own life. The legal strategy for Lil Durk's defense will likely focus on challenging the government's use of rap lyrics and social media posts as evidence, arguing that artistic expression is being criminalized. However, if the government has concrete evidence of actual criminal activity, these arguments may not be sufficient. The pressure on Lil Durk to cooperate with federal authorities will be enormous, just as it was for his father 30 years ago. The government will likely offer reduced sentences in exchange for information about other individuals or organizations, creating the same impossible choice between loyalty and freedom that his father faced. The impact of Lil Durk's case on the hip-hop industry will be significant regardless of the outcome. If he is convicted, it will send a message to other artists about the risks of maintaining connections to street life while achieving mainstream success. If he is acquitted, it may embolden others to continue similar behavior. The broader implications for criminal justice reform are also significant. The use of artistic expression as evidence in criminal cases raises important First Amendment questions that could have implications far beyond hip-hop. The targeting of successful Black artists and entrepreneurs by federal law enforcement continues patterns of discrimination that have persisted for generations. The role of community organizations like Chicago Cred in breaking cycles of violence and incarceration will become even more important as this case unfolds. The work that Big Durk has been doing since his release represents a model for how formerly incarcerated individuals can contribute to positive change in their communities. The economic impact of mass incarceration on Black families and communities is demonstrated clearly in the story of the Banks family. The loss of Big Durk's earning potential during his 25 years in prison, combined with the potential loss of Lil Durk's current success, represents millions of dollars in lost wealth and opportunity. As we reach the end of this story, it's important to remember that we're not just talking about statistics or legal cases. We're talking about human lives, families torn apart, and communities devastated by cycles of violence and incarceration. Big Durk's transformation from drug kingpin to community advocate shows that redemption is possible, even after decades of incarceration. His work with Chicago Cred represents a genuine attempt to break the cycles that destroyed his own life and threatened his community. But his son's current legal troubles suggest that breaking generational cycles is more complicated than individual transformation. The same federal system that imprisoned Big Durk for 25 years is now targeting Lil Durk, despite his success in building a legitimate business empire through music. The $8 million that Big Durk made moving drugs in the 1990s cost him 25 years of freedom and nearly destroyed his family. The millions that Lil Durk has made through music may now cost him his own freedom, continuing a cycle that began before he was even born. Some will see this as justice. The idea that criminal behavior, whether in the drug trade or through violent retaliation, must be punished regardless of the perpetrator's success or background. Others will see it as evidence of a system that criminalizes Black success and uses the full weight of federal law enforcement to destroy Black families and communities. What's undeniable is that the story of Big Durk and Lil Durk represents something larger than individual choices or criminal behavior. It's a story about how poverty, systemic racism, and limited opportunities create cycles that persist across generations, even when individuals achieve remarkable success. The question that remains is whether this cycle can finally be broken, or whether the next generation of the Banks family will face the same choices that have defined their legacy for over 30 years. Whether you see this as karma, injustice, or the inevitable result of choices made long ago, one thing is certain. The story of how Big Durk made $8 million moving drugs has consequences that continue to reverberate through his family and community today. The streets don't forget, the feds don't forgive, and sometimes the sins of the father really are visited upon the son. This has been the story of Big Durk, Lil Durk, and the $8 million that changed everything.